This edition of MacVoices is brought to you by SaneBox, the way to take control of your out-of-control email. For a 14-day free trial and $10 credit, visit sanebox.com/MacVoices. Guys, this has been really interesting, and I hate to move on, but I want to make sure we don't spend the whole time on Beats, because really that's not why we convened this jury. This jury was convened to talk a little bit about Apple v. Samsung, and now that some of the dust has settled and the smoke is cleared, Ken and Mark had been part of a MacJury we did a while back to talk about it. Mike Rose had been part of that. He couldn't join us, so John has been gracious enough to fill in. So, John, for that reason, I'm going to give you first shot at this. Apple v. Samsung. Surprise, miscarriage of justice, absolute proper justice. Where do you stand on this?
Well, I think it's a miscarriage. The thing that sticks out in my mind is that the jury process is a difficult one. To get a neutral jury is in the context of these trials, which are tremendously complex and technical, doesn't give Apple the result that it had sought. The judges that are involved are showing a tendency to resist embargoes because they don't want to punish users who are already in that system. And third, I'm kind of getting a sense that these trials are sort of good news and bad news for Apple. It's good news in the sense that anybody else who copies Apple, and there aren't too many significant competitors left, would be sobered to get into court with Apple. On the other hand, I'm a little bit concerned that Apple's lawyers weren't able to present the situation in a slam dunk case in this most recent trial, so that the jury really had a good understanding of what Samsung was doing. There was a great article at Vanity Fair about how Samsung has done this before, and they're very good at it. Vanity Fair, I believe, described the process as infringe, litigate, stall. So I think maybe Apple and executives are perhaps on one part pleased with the succession of wins, but I don't think they're achieving the goals that they had originally set out. Everything's an appeal. Apple hasn't received any money at all that I know of yet. And so recently I wrote an article about how these court battles with Samsung might be changing Apple's thinking a little bit. Maybe, in the article I wrote, maybe the way to go is to move towards hardware that is a lot more difficult to copy than software patents. With software patents, you publish them to the USPTO, that's eventually exposed to the world. It's possible to infringe on the patents and end up paying a fee. The embargoes from import have not worked. But hardware is especially difficult to mimic. And so in the article I wrote, I talked about Sapphire a lot, about the exotic manufacturing techniques of Sapphire, how these industrial processes are trade secrets. They don't have to be disclosed. If you've got a really cool secret proprietary technique that nobody knows about for creating a great sapphire face or envelope or machining it or making it do things that nobody else can do, that's really hard to copy. And so in one sense, I see that Apple's going to continue litigating against infringers. But I think, on the other hand, I suspect that there may be a feeling like, this isn't going the way we expected it to go. I always had this fantasy, maybe it's just myself, that if Steve Jobs were alive, see, I said it, that if the lawyers didn't succeed very well, they'd all be fired because he was really a great match here. But as good as Apple's lawyers are, Samsung's lawyers are also very good, obviously. And so I'm thinking Apple's got to find a way to move on, put this in parallel, but also re-emphasize new directions so that they can immunize themselves against these software patents, which were all kind of a difficult situation conceived years ago as a solution to a problem of copywriting code, which didn't work. I remember the Microsoft infringement back in 88 to 94, and Apple lost that. Why, anybody can put a trash can on a desktop, as long as it looks different. So that didn't work. And so we got into software patents, and that's not working. So I'm suspecting that maybe better hardware, harder to copy hardware, could be a supplement to Apple's approach.
John just brought up something that just pushed my blood pressure up, and that was the Microsoft situation way back when. I was highly offended by that. I'm offended by this verdict. Ken, are you offended by this verdict?
It's honestly starting to feel a bit to me. I was trying to figure out why, and I think Mike Rose actually said this in one of the emails before this show. He said he didn't follow this trial very closely, and neither did I. And I was trying to figure out exactly why I didn't follow it closely as it was happening. And about the only thing I could think of is it's almost become like operations at this point. Try to think back of like any operations story about Apple that I've covered, and there are very few that I've really paid attention to. Worker mistreatment by Foxconn is one, or alleged worker mistreatment by Foxconn, depending on which side of that you're on. The time that Apple locked up 3 years of Flash back in 2005 for what seemed like a ridiculous amount of money because all they needed Flash for was iPods at the time, and there weren't that many iPods that used Flash. Otherwise, Apple's operations are good, and they're sort of off on the side, and you don't pay attention to it unless something blows up, right? And it sort of feels like this is what the Samsung v. Apple v. Samsung thing has become, or the Apple v. Samsung v. Apple thing. I mean, however you want to say that. This is just going to keep happening now. And part of it feels like, is because somebody said the last time they had this big court battle a couple of years ago, that Apple is actually required to sue. Not required sounds silly. It's not like they're required by law to sue. But if they don't sue, then they run the risk of not protecting their patent. If they go ahead and let somebody else, do it and not sue them for it, then anybody can come by and do that and steal it. This just feels, though, now like this is going to be that thing. This is going to be off on the side. This is like, here, I'll throw a Star Trek reference in. This is going to be like a private little war. We're gonna keep funding these two law firms to keep fighting each other, because that's just, this is now just a cost of doing business. There's no way this can actually solve anything, because they're always having to sue like two products back, right? Apple is, if Apple goes to file suit against Samsung's infringement right now, they're going to be filing against maybe the Galaxy S4 and the Galaxy S5. And by the time it gets to court, Samsung will be selling the Galaxy S6 and the Galaxy S7. And so even if they win, it's for something 2 years ago, and then they still have to go back and relitigate, and they still have to go back and relitigate unless they say, okay, unless they can fast track it because something that they won on this product from 2 years ago is still being used, then they might be able to make something go a little bit faster there. But the thing is, Samsung's outside attorney, I was just reading before the show, trying to refresh, my thinking on it. Samsung's outside attorney says, look, they're never going to get a dime. Apple's never going to get a dime on this. They're not going to be able to beat Android this way. They just need to go ahead and quit. Well, they're not going to go ahead and quit. This is now just an accepted cost of doing business. And it would have made headlines if they had gotten the $2 billion that they wanted, and it made headlines because they got 6% of what they wanted. Except the Samsung lawyer had honestly read a tiny bit smug. He knows they're not writing that check anytime soon. They may never write that check, because there's an appeal and there's another appeal. And by the way, we're going to appeal the $930 billion verdict from last year as well, he actually said in the article. It's just, it's like part of operations now. This is just going to happen. And there's nothing, because of the appeals, because they keep changing stuff just a tiny bit. And because you're suing 2 years back, it just feels like it's I find the whole thing offensive, honestly. But the verdict, yeah, I wish the verdict had been different because the headlines would have been different. And, maybe it would have given somebody pause, as John said. $100 million or $119 million isn't going to give many companies out there pause. I think BlackBerry would even roll the dice on that, and as much trouble as they're on at this point. I think they would roll the dice on 119 million if they felt like they had, something like that they might score big on. So the whole thing's kind of depressing. It's fun. Beats. Sorry.
Mark, I think Ken just gave us a commentary on the American legal system, if nothing else. How about you on the Samsung v. Apple?
Okay, so there's many ways of looking at it. One is, if I were to ask the question, I think both John and Ken have answered. Am I offended by it? No, I'm not. I'm a little surprised at the size of the verdict. So I dug in, and there's some procedural changes in the trial that explain that, and we can get into that if people want to do a deep dive on on how trials like this are run. But I really think that this reminds me of that scene in Monty Python, where they're fighting the Black Knight, and he hacks off his arms and legs, and and he says, "Let me go." And he says, "No, it's just a flesh wound," And then later on, I think in the same movie, they're on the fort, and they say, "Go away, or I will taunt you again." I think that's exactly the spirit between Apple and Samsung right now. Is Samsung's telling Apple, "Go away, or I'll taunt you again." Bottom line, they ripped off a design. It's very difficult, to actually prove that. I think that one of the reasons that this trial wasn't covered as much is it's old news, right? I mean, the trial was two years ago. This is just a replay on some technicalities. Well, in some of those technicalities, some of the patents are the same. Others were dismissed. They consolidated the caseload. So I think that some of the so-called design patents that really just charred Samsung with abject copying or slavishly copying, whether that was Ivy or Phil Schiller or whoever it was who said that, wasn't presented wasn't presented at this trial. The reason I say I believe is it wasn't very heavily covered because it's old news. So I think really this shows a lot more about the troubles of software patents. The fact that they've spent hundreds of millions of dollars on this, and to a simple man, it's very clear. Samsung, you remember these exhibits from the last trial? They showed all the Samsung phones before iPhone announced. They all had buttons and different size keyboards and different type of keyboards and folding keyboards. After that, they all went soft with virtual keyboard. So it's really clear. They at some level, it all got copied. Now, I'm not sure if Apple is pursuing the right type of legal strategy because so much of this turns on the minutia of patent law that it makes me wonder, would they have been better served had they approached it as as a copyright? Because I think that would give them a little bit broader protection, where you could actually take a look at, yes, your icons are the same size, they have the same sort of things within them, they have roughly the same color scheme. I think that might potentially have given them a better or different trial outcome. But they didn't do that. For whatever reason, I think they were locked into this mindset that we have these hundreds of patents and they will protect us. Obviously they got limited protection. So now the question is, there are certainly more patents that they could file against Samsung. I think at this point they have two jury verdicts that indicate that Samsung has infringed in a significant way on some of their patents. Is it worth it to pursue it? That's the key question that they need to be asking themselves, because they didn't win an injunction. An injunction might if they want to take the long game, they could come back and they could focus on newer, Samsung phones, and then maybe put together a track record that's showing, yes, generation to generation they've, infringed. So the only remedy is we need to, enjoin them from selling into the U.S. That would be an extraordinary, outcome. It might be fair, but I don't see it happening.
There's an interesting thing that what you say reminds me of. When you say that maybe they could have gone for a copyright, I'm reminded of the fight between Apple and Amazon over the term App Store. Mm-hmm. And Apple eventually walked away from that one because everybody said, well, you can't really copyright App Store. And what's fascinating to me about that is we didn't call them App Stores before Apple called theirs App Store. I mean, I had a Sidekick too. I know you could buy applications for it. I don't remember what they called the place where you could go and buy applications for it, but I don't remember them calling it an app store. Apple introduces stuff and it catches on and it almost becomes ubiquitous, like almost just by virtue of the fact that Apple does it. Yeah, paying not included. And all of a sudden we're like, well, of course, that makes perfect sense. Yes. It would be called an app store because it's a store that sells apps. So we're all going to call it that. And then when Apple says, well, wait a minute, ours is actually called App Store, and everybody's like, oh, come on, it's just a thing, right? There was a fascinating thing a few years ago where, I guess maybe a year and a half ago, where HP was getting ridiculed heavily, if not actually, I don't remember if there was a threat of litigation or not, but they were basically turning out computers that looked exactly like MacBook Pros. Mm-hmm. And the guy at HP said, what? It's just what a computer looks like. Well, yeah, now it wasn't. It wasn't. But then Apple does it, and there's just something. And I hate how fanboy this makes me sound, but I mean, there's in a lot of what they do, not in everything they do, but in a lot of what they do, there's just something about it. It's like, this works, this fits, this feels right. And everybody's like, yeah, it does, doesn't it? Yeah, well, we could probably do a little bit of that. And then when Apple comes back and says, what are you doing? That was our thing. They're like, no, look around. Everybody's doing this.
I think that's one of the reasons why some analysts are panicking for the next great thing. And we've all written about how Apple takes its time, studies the situation, thinks deeply about solutions, and comes out with something that solves a fundamental human problem. And they certainly seem to be taking their sweet time with the next generation Apple TV project, if it still exists, and the iWatch and health and fitness. But there have been some people who say the only way to deal with that situation is to accelerate the innovation and to come out with the next big thing in a hurry so that you're always riding the wave. I'm not convinced of that, but considering what we just talked about, I may be swayed a little bit more towards a more frequent update cycle, so that Apple can use its talents and innovation to jump ahead. And by the time somebody's copied them, they've moved on to the next thing.
Well, except
I don't know. Seems like a good idea now that I think of it more.
Except what you're talking about, right, is, I mean, you're actually talking about something that's completely game-changing. I mean, Apple has, I mean, you say, every time somebody says, well, the latest iPhone is just, evolutionary, not revolutionary, hold the latest iPhone up next to the first iPhone. And I mean, and the fact that, it took steps to get from that point to this point. I mean, they're still innovating quite a bit between each phone, whether people want to call that revolutionary or not. As far as though, like actually trying to, I mean, what the next barn burner is? Wow, best of luck. I don't.
Yeah, you don't pull those out of the rabbit's hat. You don't pull that rabbit out of the hat with routine aplomb frequently and casually. It takes years for new revolutions to appear.
Yeah, and how do you speed that up?
Yeah, I mean, you can't force it. And otherwise, you end up making an awful mistake.
Right. You end up making the iPod hi-fi.
and how do you justify to the consumer trying to, let's just say, a product release cycle of every 9 months? Well, I'd like to think that whatever I'm buying is going to last me a little more than every 9 months, as far as being current. Do I want the product to evolve? Absolutely. But then it's a question of how much money am I going to pay, or are we into that old thing of, well, I'll wait till the next one. I'll wait till the next one. We still have that going on with the iPhone, and that's not a good business model. That's the one that Apple's chosen, as opposed to several of the other Androids who they just seem to throw them at the wall every 10 minutes. I personally can't keep up. I don't know if you guys can.
Personally, I like the fact that Apple does it that way, though. I mean, it seems to me that it's locked into the 2-year upgrade cycle here in the States. I mean, whether other countries like it, and certainly now that you've got the whole thing where you can pay for T-Mobile Jump or AT&T Next, you can pay extra, and then you can upgrade more frequently. It seems to me that the iPhone releases are built on the 2-year upgrade cycle. So I've got the iPhone 5. And the iPhone 5S is going to be a little bit faster. It's going to be a little bit different, but it's not going to be so wildly different that I'm going to hate my iPhone 5. I just know that, well, next year it's going to be even faster and it's going to be really different. And so I'm going to have that. And it's the same thing with the people on the S cycle, right? Well, I didn't want the iPhone 3G because it was a first gen model. But then, once I got the iPhone 3GS, okay, so they got the bugs worked out of that one, then I've got it. They might spend a year with, sort of the envy of, well, the iPhone 4 looks so much better than the 3GS, but it's going to have the first year of bugs, antenna gate, right? And by the time the iPhone 4S comes out, that thing's solid and my 2 years are up. I mean, I love the fact that I don't have to worry. I mean, I guess it was really the iPhone 4S was the first time that you kind of got hosed on that because the iPhone 4S had Siri where the iPhone 4 didn't. So it wasn't just a speed bump, but it was actual functionality that you couldn't have. That was the first time I really felt let down by that. Otherwise, I love the fact that the phone that I get is probably going to be Apple's phone for the next couple of years because I'm on the first wave, not the S wave.
And you're right. It depends on which wave you're in as to whether, I hit it lucky. This is the year they made the big thing that's important to me, or, I either now have to make a decision about buying off cycle or hanging in for a year.
Yeah.
Mark, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to try to redirect back in, just try to think forward. How will this end? One way might be, they negotiate, royalty payments, back and forth between them. It may not, satisfy to the extent, that the Apple executive team, wants to, destroy Android like, Steve Jobs was so famously quoted doing. But that might be one way that they can, sort of make peace over this and go forward. And then really what Apple needs to do, I think, is, better integrate, their devices so that they can drive down their manufacturing costs and, afford to sell it at lower, end user price. But, in many ways, I think that maybe people's perceptions of Apple are incorrect, in that, it seems to me for, watching them for at least since Steve Jobs went back in the late 90s, that they've been very focused on, these are our products, we come out with them, and not really caring on, we wanted to sell, but not really caring about the opinions held by, external constituencies. Then, something, magical happened, and they had, huge number of hits, with, getting on Intel, Mac sales taking off, launching, iPhone, iPhone taking off, launching iPad taking off, and then everyone thinking that, Apple, could be this huge high growth company, which is total nonsense. No company grows, very rapidly, forever. At some point, their growth, comes back. And, I think we've been through the past 2 or 3 years that realization that, Apple's no longer that corporate teenager that's growing an inch a month. It's now back to a normal growth rate, and so therefore, I think they're continuing. It seems focusing on bringing out high quality new products. Maybe they might be able to accelerate it by an acquisition like Beats that they can get into new markets or new segments. But until that, whatever that next quote Ken's term, whatever that next barn burner is, I think is back. It's Tim Cook is saying the truth. They're focusing on making their best products, and they're going to do it, and focus on high margin and be very, very, very profitable. So in that regard, it's really what comes next. And the thing about innovation is you never really know when it's going to happen. It could happen this September, or it could happen September 5 years from now. But until then, I think we can look at and see the sort of things Apple is going to be doing, and that's why I was saying in the discussion we had about Beats Music that I think Apple is focusing on a long-term game of being able to expand the size and attractiveness of its overall ecosystem, as a way to bring in new users, especially since they're, I wish that they would start to report statistics for iPhone like they do for Mac, where their Mac for many years they say, and half for with this percentage of new Mac sold this quarter was sold to new Mac owners for the very first time. I wish they would start to think about doing a switching campaign for iPhone and then start to report those things, because I believe that truly there is benefit of the device. Now there's a certain segment of the market that's very, very cost sensitive, and then I think there's others that if they would sample and learn, they could appreciate what iPhone and its ecosystem offers, and I think Apple could start to grow with that. And maybe that's the hidden message in the Beats acquisition is try to start to proselytize and convert other Android carrying users into iPhone.
This edition of Mac Voices is brought to you by SaneBox, the best way to take control of your out-of-control email. For a free trial and a $10 credit, visit sanebox.com/MacVoices. Probably the most asked question I get about sponsorships on Mac Voices is, do you really use the products, or are they just advertisers? That's a legitimate question. The truth is that if I'm not already a user, I always try out a new sponsor's product, both for my personal use as well as to communicate the experience to you. That whole process is much easier when I'm already familiar with the product, and even easier when I already use it. And that's what happened when SaneBox became a Mac Voices sponsor. I was already a user, and a very satisfied user at that. I didn't even wait until the trial period was over before I signed up for one of their longer-term contracts. It's just that good. If you feel like you're a slave to your email and can never get caught up, turn SaneBox loose on your overflowing inbox, and it will immediately prioritize the important stuff and leave it in your inbox. The rest goes to the Sane Later folder. And that's just the start, since you now know what goes in your inbox really belongs there and really is important. And the Sane Later folder stuff, not so much. The next step is to use some of the other SaneBox folders to your benefit. Folders like the Sane Archive, where your oldest emails go, or Sane Bulk, so your receipts and reference emails will always end up in the same place, not cluttering your inbox. Sane News, so your newsletter subscriptions and email lists are all aggregated into one folder. And the Sane Not Spam folder, where SaneBox can put things it thinks might be important, but there also might be some attributes of spam. When an email lands there, you decide what it really is, and SaneBox will learn, and there's more that we'll talk about later. For now, though, I really want you to go to sanebox.com/MacVoices and get their 14-day free trial. You will see a big difference in your inbox and will quickly become addicted to the idea that your emails get sliced and diced into separate folders for you to deal with at your leisure. And when you sign up, you get a $10 credit, no matter which SaneBox plan you choose. That's sanebox.com/MacVoices for your 14-day free trial and $10 credit on any SaneBox plan. SaneBox, the best way to take control of your out-of-control email. Thanks to SaneBox for sponsoring this edition of Mac Voices.
One of the things I've noticed, Mark, is that when analysts, writers, bloggers, whoever is critical of Apple, they tend to divide and conquer. And they pick one specific thing about how Apple's not being innovative enough, or they're not winning these court cases. But from time to time, I like to think about Apple as a whole. They're still selling more iPads than any other single company is selling tablets. They've got a whole lot of money in the bank. Apple and Samsung are splitting all the profits to be made in the smartphone business. Apple's got a thriving business selling just about everything that they sell. The company's healthy. It may not be growing, as you said, at the rate that some investors would like. But when you think about the products that Apple sells, they're unquestionably awesome. And Apple's unquestionably successful across the spectrum, even though there you can take pot shots at them in little ways. So that's one of the things I appreciate about Apple is that, I love this new 21-inch iMac that I've got. It has no moving parts, SSD. It's awesomely beautiful display. My iPad Air is just about the coolest thing I've ever seen in my life. A window to the universe, and it's so well made. So there isn't that general celebration of Apple as a whole. And when Apple does put all those pieces into place, and they do work hard at solving problems, those innovations are going to come as a natural part of the process. And so to pick and choose which thing you're going to complain about at Apple to make them look bad, this doesn't really work well with me.
Guys, we're out of time. I want to wrap it up though with one thing. And John, it's kind of what you were saying. There was a piece in Business Insider, I think it was last week, and I'll put it in the show notes. And folks, you need to go and look at it. It's 11 amazing facts about Apple, and really, it's kind of 11 amazing financial facts about Apple with the money that each one of their products generates and how much revenue. It's quite surprising. It really is. They compare you just. I can't quote it off the top, but I think it's the iPhone is a bigger business than all of Microsoft combined.
Yes,
those kind of things. And it really does. When you hear all this fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and the negative comments and people picking at Apple, go and look at that, and you realize Apple. It's not invulnerable, but it can take a lot of hits in a lot of ways, including a lot of the critics, and just keep on rolling. It's quite the juggernaut.
So what do you think the meaning is of Satya Nadella saying that Windows Phone OS will be free for OEMs on, I believe their size was 6-inch diagonal or less or smaller screens? I mean, it seems to me that is potentially very game changing if you fast forward over 18 to 24 months at the expense of Android.
Why?
Because I think right now, Microsoft is going to all the Android makers and collecting, generally believed, somewhere in the range of $12 to $15 royalty per unit. So they have a hidden tax on it. So they can go in and say, well, just switch over, and you won't have to pay that, or we'll allow you to cut that in half, or some other number that makes it commercially more attractive, for the other manufacturers to think, gee, Microsoft Phone OS is going to be lower cost than Android because the guys at Google infringed on Microsoft patents, and as the phone manufacturer, they're the ones stuck paying the bill.
It seems like that only becomes a threat, though, if the whole Android Silver rumor ends up being true. I mean, for people who didn't hear that, it's this idea that basically Google is going to try to reclaim Android from Samsung, and so they will partner with a few select partners. They'll run a pure version of Android on it, and nobody will be allowed to put crapware on. So, I'm assuming that, would Windows let people fork the operating system? My guess would be not. But, it seems like that only becomes an issue if Windows actually will let people fork the operating system, because all of the services and crapware that everybody who's got an Android, who's licensing Android, I assume they're doing that because they're making some money off of it, right? It's not just so they can, have a free $15 operating system.
Okay, so to answer that question, let's dig in and understand what are the forces that would lead them to need to fork, the OS.
I assume it's making money. Offering other services and offering other things that from which they can nickel and dime the people who are buying the phones. That's my guess. Am I wrong about that? And I'm happy for you to tell me I am.
That's what Amazon does.
Okay, so I'm not quite sure I understand your argument. So that's what let me try to dig in, because if you're HTC, you're making a phone, you're under, to a large extent, the thumb of one of the phone operators around the world, and it's the phone operator who's saying put this crapware on it, So basically, as a result, you're forced to do that. While at the same time, Microsoft lawyers have come and knocking, and you're having to pay them a royalty because Android infringes, and as a manufacturer, they're the ones who's stuck holding the ball. So by changing it, Microsoft could go in and maybe they make it 10%, or half or free at some level. It's cheap enough and lower cost, that they could get the phone OEMs to switch over to Windows Phone OS and boot Android to the curb, while also Microsoft is big enough that they already have relationships with the carrier, so they can minimize the amount of crapware that they put in, or tailor it so that you're using Bing Maps and Bing Search and so on and so forth. So I'm thinking longer term, this may be a bigger threat to the Android ecosystem than more patent trials that Apple launches.
But Mark, the Android has so firmly entrenched itself into the psyche of its fans and the world that I don't think any maker who's using Android is going to give that edge up, because we know how Android's growing and has been stealing market share from iOS, and there's distinct classes of individuals who partake in this Android iOS war, like the old PC and Mac wars. And any maker of phones has got to look at that $15 savings and the meager percentage popularity of Windows Phone, and seriously ponder whether they're going to give up the huge advantage of wrapping themselves in the favor of Android in order to make a little money. I just don't see that.
Well, I reflect back to the comment you made earlier, John, that only Apple and Samsung are making profit. So I think all the lower tier manufacturers, I think they have a very credible reason why they should change right away. Especially if maybe Microsoft takes a long approach and does something analogous to what they did with Nokia and offer them maybe you have the OS and it's free for 2 years or 5 years, or we'll pay you payments for 2 years. I think at some point dollars will speak, and Android's attractive because it's nominally free. I think the big surprise to everybody was Microsoft had such a strong patent position that it went out and is able to get whatever the amount, $12, $15 per unit royalty fees off of the Android OS. So I think that just financial pressure, the companies will decide, okay, do we want to get out of this business or do we want to change? And I think that's the existential threat that they're going to face. And I certainly think even Samsung is well enough motivated by profit that they may decide, well, let's offer a Galaxy 7 and a Galaxy 7M. We'll price them appropriately and let the market decide which one it wants.
I've seen an article to that effect. I think I wrote about it in Particle Debris a few weeks ago. Samsung would very much like to seize control of the customer relationship by having its own operating system and move away from Android eventually.
Right. And I think Microsoft, right. And so that wanting to do that sets them on a collision course with Google. Microsoft can be a white knight to save, to help save them there.
One of the things I wanted to mention before we left is that I've never seen anything from Mr. Satella I didn't like. The guy's smart. He's technical. Every time Steve Ballmer says something, you just groan. Every time Satya Nadella says something, you think, wow, this guy's smart. And so I'm optimistic about Microsoft, more so than I was before under Ballmer.
And Mark, I don't want to have this come out as snarky, and it invariably is going to. But who is out there that is clamoring for these Windows phones?
Well, I think I assert that that's not the right way of looking at it. It's not that people are clamoring for it now, but what will happen, if you're, Microsoft or some of these, other OEMs, phone OEMs, developing the market over the next couple of years, making, the phone more attractive so that, incrementally, a year from now, more people are going to buy it, and 15 months from now, more people are going to be buying it, so that you're slowly getting on some sort of growth curve, displacing, Android devices. And it would be really fascinating to see how quickly, a curve like that, could grow. Because if Microsoft wanted to, they could accelerate it just by, spending and infusing some cash. The danger is that, they may get themselves trapped and not be able to, ever make profits.
And because what I heard in your example was a race to the bottom again with Microsoft, which they seem to be very good at doing. Ken, I'm sorry.
Well, yes. I think Mark's idea is interesting, although I think you're right about that too, as far as the race to the bottom thing. Unless the whole idea is to get people into your ecosystem. So, I mean, probably in that Business Insider piece that you were talking about, they talked about the size of the iTunes business as well. Microsoft isn't going to build that kind of ecosystem on the mobile side if they can't get people to actually adopt their phones, right? So it's an interesting idea. It's a really interesting idea. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I have nothing to say about it except it's a really interesting idea because it hadn't even crossed my mind that could be a threat to.
They got to do something.
Yeah, because
that's for sure.
Yeah, because sort of this take I have is that Nadella sees that they want to make money on back end cloud and other services, and that maybe long term at some point they'd like to make money off of devices, but they've recognized the company screwed up in the past and they have no position there. So instead of continuing to put good money after bad, he's recognizing, okay, hey, we're not a player. Let's try to create users. Let's make it easy for phone and tablet makers under 6 inches or whatever the precise threshold is. They can license this for free.
You're not wrong, Chuck. It does sound like a race to the bottom, but I mean, if you make it a physical thing for a second, would you rather have a $15 thing sitting on the shelf or a $5 thing that's out the door?
Yeah, and I understand that there's a value to a lower price item, just like there's a value proposition in Apple making iWork on the iDevices free, well, and the Mac too, that it's enhancing that. So if you could see Windows Phone as enhancing these handsets for a lower price, absolutely, and as part of a longer term strategy, yeah, maybe, but.
Well, if you can take the $15 that you were paying to Google though and turn it back into either your marketing or your hardware development or both, then maybe you've actually got a better phone. Maybe you're able to actually turn some of that money back in, or maybe you become the third smartphone maker to make a profit.
Yeah. I think I think that's probably at some level what they're all trying to hope for is, okay, well, because right now I think it's LG who's the only other one who's making tiny amounts of profit, right? Yeah, John, I think isn't it between Apple and Samsung that they make 98 or maybe?
No, it's 106%.
It's 106. Yeah, it's that guy from it's T. Michael Walkley, isn't it, from Canaccord, who's like, okay, well, these guys are making this money, but then everybody else is losing money, so we're going to take the money that they're losing, add it to the money they're making, and then make the losers feel like real losers.
Right, but the thing is, that's what makes it so unstable, right? Is they can't stay in business forever. At some point, those companies are going to wake up and, get out of it like, other august, handset makers have.
One of the things I talk about is technical currents. You have these emotional currents that percolate through Facebook and Twitter. And you can do all of the finagling you want and do business propositions behind the scenes and try to take actions that can increase the rate of growth of Windows Phone. But in the end, you're fighting the mentality of users who are entrenched in an iPhone and Android. And there has to be some remarkable social upheaval that says, oh, yeah, I want a phone made by Microsoft. This is the cat's pajamas,
John, the way you say that, there's an embedded assumption, that that buyer passionately wants and is entrenched with an Android device. I'm sure some people are, but I believe that the majority are. the phone is broken. They need to go in, what's cool, what's hot. And then whatever the spiff is that, that AT&T or Verizon, et cetera, sales guy has, that's the phone they're going to sell to that person. And
I don't know, these subsidies all kind of equalize things, whether it's an iPhone 5S or a Samsung phone, you're going to pay $199,
right. But that is absent of behavior that's not really as present maybe in the iPhone sales, which is, if you're Samsung, if you're paying a spiff, if you're paying $50 to the salesman, if he sells a Galaxy and, what's he going to get? Nothing, or maybe $10 for selling a Microsoft phone. He's going to sing the praises of how that Samsung phone is great, and it's just like an iPhone, but it costs 2/3 the amount, because everyone knows Apple is overpriced, and you would not want Microsoft because they're nowhere, they're going out of business. Nokia is dead. So there's a lot of factors that they'll put on distributed at the point of sale level.
Yeah, the other thing I will say is, the iPhone tends to be the one that holds on to the $199 price point for the longest. I had a friend who I can't remember, it was in the last year, he was going to buy a phone, and he kept asking me about my iPhone 5, and he went to the store to buy an iPhone 5 or 5S, I can't remember which, and he ended up walking out with a Samsung something. Because it cost him $50 less, and because the guy told him, well, it's got something very much like Siri, and it's got all this stuff. And in fairness, I've seen his phone more than I've seen anything outside of an iPhone in quite a while, and it's not a bad phone. What he walked out with was not a bad phone, but you don't walk into. He went to Sprint. You don't walk into Sprint. All things aren't equal once you're past the door. It's right. As Mark said, it's, whatever is being pushed that week, or, which manufacturer actually reduce their price for a limited time only. So act now. It's not all equal. I tend to agree with Mark. I think there are definitely some diehard Android users out there. But I think most people who go into a store to buy a smartphone don't have a preconceived idea. If they don't go in to buy an iPhone or a Samsung Galaxy, maybe. If they're just walking out with a random Android phone, they weren't the Android people. I think right now it's more a battle between Apple and Samsung than it is between iOS and Android.
Yeah, so I would say, okay, so let's do a little bit of a thought experiment. So assume that Apple and Android have as much diehard users. So Apple is like 20%, 22% market share. Samsung is 66%. So 66 minus 22, that's what? There's 44%. So assume those are the people who they just go in and they get sold whatever the device is. If Apple could start to capture, some of that, they could, in theory, they could potentially double, their market share. So that's why I think that longer term, the next battle is going to be about encroaching customers. And that's why, going back to our Beats discussion, everything Apple can do to make their device, their ecosystem, their experience superior, because at some point, I've just got to believe that some of those swing buyers, if you want to call them that, they will start to do more web surfing and buying and other things with their device if they actually have a device that makes it a much more enjoyable experience, and instead of the impossible pain that the crappy phone that they got sold just doesn't let them do and appreciate.
Well, one of the things we haven't talked about is security. People talk a lot about features and comparison charts, and Samsung is all too happy to generate a comparison chart. It says, look, we have this feature and that feature, and Apple doesn't. But I see Apple focusing on a particular group of customers, professionals and people who are very sensitive to the idea of being technical professionals who have a little bit of extra money, paying for that secure enclave and that fingerprint recognition and the security of the phone. And I think Apple has maybe not pushed that as much as they could. And there's the curation process of the App Store too. And we all write about that, and we all tell our readers, look, you've got curation and you've got excellent security internal to the phone that should be important to you, but it doesn't seem to sway the market share as much as it should. But I think it's important to a big class of customers.
Do you think Apple will launch, developer APIs to use that thumbprint, at WWDC next month?
It's a good question. I've heard that discussed. My gut feeling is they will not, because that's a key differentiator for Apple. They want to maintain control over that to make sure that their security is not compromised.
Ken, I want to go back to your friend that bought the phone. I'm curious, have any of the three of you gentlemen, whether you were going to buy a suit or a pair of jeans or a pair of shoes or whatever, have you ever had a salesman say to you, that looks really terrible on you?
No.
No, of course not. Of course not.
Yes, one time, actually. I remember one time I tried on a hat and the guy was like, no, put it back.
Okay, so you may be the exception.
Yeah.
The salesmen are always going to, steer you in one direction or another. And unfortunately, a lot of the time, it's to their benefit, not yours. Please don't do that, folks. I mean, I got to. That's another one, Ken. My blood pressure just shot right up because Okay, so your friends save $50, and I don't know your friend, so I can say it with impunity. Maybe he's not sophisticated enough, or to appreciate, or maybe he just needed a phone and then wanted to play a couple games or something on it.
Yeah.
But when you're going to go and spend any kind of serious money, do this much research. Don't depend on the salespeople, please.
I honestly, I was a little offended that he showed me his phone.
Yeah.
because we spent seriously over a month talking about whether or not he was going to get an iPhone. And I was upfront too. I was like, maybe you don't need it. I wasn't trying to sell him on it, but every time he asked me a question about it, I showed it to him and he thought it was really cool. And then he came back with something telling me that it was almost the same. And you're right. It's almost the same.
Right.
It's not the same.
Yeah. Those size 40 pants almost fit. That size 10 shoe almost fits.
Yeah.
But you can probably use a 10.5. Ah, jeez. Guys, this has been amazing. This has been a marathon jury. I feel sure that when I go to edit it, I'm going to split it into two parts because I don't think anybody's going to want to sit through all of this. But
Here.
This has been really, really interesting. Folks, this is what happens when you get three intelligent people and me together. A lot of fun, a lot of good discussion. John, thanks for being here. In fact, the sun has gone down on you.
Yeah, it's getting kind of gloomy in here.
Yeah.
Kind of cave.
Ken, it's great to see you. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you very much for having me, Chuck. I appreciate it.
And Mark, of course, it's always great to see you. We'll get you and everybody else back here on the MacJury.
Thank you. This was a great discussion. Thank you all.
Has been. Folks, I'm Chuck Joyner. Please check out our show notes for everything that we've been discussing. I'll also have bios for all of our panelists so you can go and find out what they do when they're not here because they're all doing a lot of interesting things. Until the next time, and as always, thanks for watching. Visit MacVoices.com for links, show notes, to subscribe, to connect with Chuck on Twitter, app.net, Google+, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Subscribe to our weekly newsletter, the MacVoices Dispatch, to stay up to date with all the latest MacVoices news from our front page or at MacVoices.com/newsletter. Advertising and sponsorships handled by Backbeat Media at BackbeatMedia.com.